This lecture has been made available to you courtesy of the American Numismatic Society.
All right, our next speaker, Dr. Jesse Kraft, has already spoken to you, but has not yet received a proper introduction. Jesse is a 2017 graduate of the ANS Summer Seminar, and he also spent a great deal of time doing various volunteer internships here at the ANS before he finished his PhD at the University of Delaware in 2019. And shortly after that, we were very happy to offer Jesse a job as Assistant Curator of the Coinages of the Americas. Since joining the ANS in 2019, Jesse has been hugely energetic. He has been coordinating the revival of the COAC, and I'd like to thank him again for organizing or co-organizing the COAC today. Jesse has also been very instrumental in organizing and dealing with the massive purchase of the Medallic Art Company's archives, which we purchased a number of years ago. And he will be speaking today about Victor David Brenner and the Medallic Art Company, which I'm sure has come out of a lot of the work that he's been doing on that. But in addition to all of this other work, he also has been very prolific in publications, publishing a number of articles in the Journal of Early American Numismatics and the ANS magazine, and is currently working on a book that looks at the intersection of various currencies and their uses in the 18th and early 19th century United States. So Jesse, all yours.
Thank you, everyone. Today I'm going to be giving my talk on the Medallic Art Company and the enduring legacy of Victor David Brenner. Victor David Brenner has a legacy that begins with the Lincoln Cent, but it is also greatly complemented by nearly 300 other works that he sculpted throughout his lifetime. While the Medallic Arts aren't necessarily as widely collected as coins are, and the average person does not encounter a medal as often as they do a coin, certain medals and plaquettes have become legendary to those in the know, while others have indeed crept into popular knowledge. Sometimes certain works of art get a little help along the way. While Mako was indispensable to Brenner since its inception in 1907, it wasn't until Brenner had passed away that Mako truly began to help solidify Brenner's legacy as an important numismatic sculptor. The relationship between Victor David Brenner and the Medallic Art Company likely began in late 1906 or early 1907. Although he hadn't yet received his famed commission for the Lincoln Cent, Brenner was already a successful sculptor, having just returned from his second stint in Paris to train under master sculptor Oscar Roti. By this point, Brenner had already sculpted dozens of pieces, most of which existed in the form of finished Galvanos. Mako, on the other hand, was still in his infancy. In fact, the company was so new that no one was even sure who owned it. Starting in 1903, Henri Wahl began to work for the Deich Brothers, who produced several silver-trimmed leather goods, most notably ladies' handbags. In order to increase ornamentation of the silver trim, the Deich Brothers purchased a VA Pantograph at the recommendation of Wahl. All too quickly, however, handbag fashion had changed, causing the Deich Brothers to consider the machine redundant. Wahl, on the other hand, was trained as a sculptor and understood the potential that the VA Pantograph could have on the Medallic Arts in America. At that point, no one else in the Western Hemisphere had one. By 1905, Henri began to reduce the models, with the very first being the unused design for the Benjamin Franklin Bicentennial Medal by Augustin St. Gaudens. Business, however, did not really pick up until 1907. At this point, the Deich Brothers also began to see the appeal in the machine, and as the rightful owners, advertised it for hire. In this advertisement, found in the 1908 catalog of the exhibition of the National Sculptra Society, you can already see that even before Mako existed as a distinct entity, their forerunners were promoting Brenner's name alongside a long list of other notable sculptors. There's no doubt that the Deich Brothers added this list of sculptors to help validate their own freshly formed company, but it also helped further solidify Brenner's career as a sculptor. Interestingly, it may be due to the success of Weil and the VA Pantograph owned by the Deich Brothers that we learn that Brenner himself may have owned a pantograph. While the VA Pantograph had perfected the process, it was by no means the first of its kind. The U.S. Mint, for instance, had some sort of pantograph for the purpose of design reduction as early as 1836. The VA Pantograph made it a practical and viable method to reduce large works of art down to the size of a coin or medal. Sometimes, works this 2 feet in diameter can be reduced smaller than an inch, and that could not have been done before so efficiently. It appears that Brenner owned one of the earlier models, known as the Contamine pantograph, seen here on the left. This is from his 1910 pamphlet written by Brenner, Art of the Medal. In the center, we see a group of advertisements from the February 1908 issue of the Jeweler's Circular. The second from the top reads, "For sale, reducing machine for dyes, electric motor and appliances," along with the name and address, Brenner, 624 Madison Avenue, New York. More than likely, Mako up and running with the most up-to-date technology, Brenner no longer needed his inferior Contamine and sold it. To the right is a VA Pantograph machine. When compared to the Contamine to the left, its superiority is immediately obvious. It truly allowed the Medallic Arts to jump from the mechanical stage to the industrial age. So how accessible was Mako to Brenner? Quite accessible. In 1909, when Brenner was at the height of his fame and most in need of the VA Pantograph, Mako was literally a city block away. With Mako at 10 East 17th Street and Brenner at 105 East 17th Street, he could and probably often did walk across Park Avenue, then Broadway, and could put any design he wished onto Mako's VA Pantograph. Though the record is a little murky, in the 2-year period between 1907 and 1909, Mako supposedly reduced at least 5 designs for Brenner: Carl Schurz plaquette, James McNeill Whistler plaquette, the International Congress on Tuberculosis medal, the Art Institute of Chicago's Norman Waite Harris Prize, and the Haney plaquette. If you don't know by now, you should by the end of this conference. 1909 was a big year for Brenner. This was, of course, the year in which he designed the famous Lincoln Cent, the most reproduced work of art in human history, which is crazy to think about. Nearly 450 billion and counting. Mako had no small part in making this happen. Although the U.S. Mint had a VA Pantograph of their own by 1909, theirs could only manage models of 9 inches in diameter or smaller. Brenner often worked in clay basins that were much larger than this. In May of that year, Henri Weil made beeswax reductions of Brenner's plaster models, then turned them into 9-inch Galvanos. These were then shipped to Philadelphia, where the U.S. Mint reduced them even further into hubs and dies to strike the small 19-millimeter coins. This relationship lasted throughout much of Brenner's career, with Mako reducing no fewer than 20 more of his designs between 1910 and 1920. It is important to note that Mako struck none of these medals. Just like the U.S. Mint struck the Lincoln Cent, other mints struck each of these medals that I've mentioned so far. This is because Mako was not yet a mint, but solely a dye reduction company. In short, artists would bring Mako their works, Mako would reduce them into dyes, and someone else would strike them. Sometimes Mako would add their own edge mark, apply the varnishes and finishes, package them up, and distribute them. This was not always the case. For many of Brenner's works that Mako reduced, few that were struck during his lifetime actually contain the Mako edge mark. More often than not, you may see markings of the Gorham Manufacturing Company, Joseph K. Davison Sons of Philadelphia, or even the U.S. Mint or the Mint in Paris. Mako reduced the dyes for the Charlotte May Buffett Smith medal, pictured here in 1910, but like all the others, did not strike it. This was the case for Mako until 1920, when Clyde Trees joined the organization and widely expanded their operations. He was the man who purchased their 51st Street location. He began to hire further employees, and he purchased their first minting press. It was only by coincidence that this was also the last year that Brenner used Mako during his lifetime. The paths of Victor Brenner and Henri Weil, as well as Henri's brother Felix, crossed in other places as well. That goes for the Deich Brothers as well. They were all members of the American Numismatic Society, the American Numismatic Association, as well as the New York Numismatic Club. At one point in 1910, Edward Deich and Victor David Brenner were placed on a three-person committee with Daniel Parrish Jr., the Committee of Foreign Metals. Brenner, however, soon pulled out, claiming that it was too much of a time commitment for him. That's what these two letters here basically state. After Brenner's death, the relationship between Mako and Brenner's work shifted. Obviously, Brenner was no longer there to bring them new works to reduce. Beginning in 1929, however, a new source for Brenner material opened up, Victor's brother, Samuel Brenner. At the time of his death, Brenner's personal collection of his works and the works of others were split into two. At least 700 pieces remained with his wife, Anne Reed Brenner. This became known as the Jasper Litt Collection and was subsequently donated to the ANS in 1987 by David Litt, Brenner's nephew-in-law. Other material went to Samuel. In 1929, he sold the rights to several pieces of Brenner's work to Mako. Most notably, this included the Motherhood Medal, as well as the famed Abraham Lincoln plaquette that was the basis for the Lincoln Cent. In 1931, about 60 more models transferred as from Samuel Brenner to the Medallic Art Company. This also included a 10.25-inch sculpture in the round of Lincoln, not a bas-relief, but an actual sculpture in the round, by Brenner, which ended up in the collection of Dick Johnson by the early 1970s. At this point, in 1929, the Motherhood Medal is an important example of this. At this point in 1929, many of these works of art became stock medals for Mako. This is where Mako really began to help solidify Brenner's legacy beyond the Lincoln Cent. Before this, many of these pieces were extremely rare and, for all intents and purposes, uncollectible. Many of the designs that Mako began to reissue after 1929 and 1931 are now some of Brenner's most recognizable and iconic works, while others have slipped into obscurity simply because of how rare they remain. I would also like to add that these restrikes do not in any way necessarily cheapen the original versions or larger formats of these models. The Mako restrikes are all very easily distinguishable from the originals. The originals remain extremely important. The restrikes, however, allow for more people to appreciate the art, and this is where Mako kind of comes into play in prolonging and pulling Brenner's enduring legacy. More likely than not, more than likely, Samuel Brenner wasn't necessarily thinking of his brother's legacy when he sold the molds and Galvanos to Mako. There is no question for me, however, that Samuel certainly understood the importance of Mako to the Medallic Arts, much like Victor had this realization early in the life of Mako. Either way, this helped crystallize Victor David Brenner as a bona fide sculptor with a large portfolio, and the only designer of the Lincoln, and not only the designer of the Lincoln Cent itself, obviously an incredible accomplishment. The Motherhood Medal, pictured here, is an important example of this. Brenner first modeled this design in 1899 while a student of Oscar Roti in Paris. In 1911, Brenner chose this design for his turn as medalist for the Circle of the Friends of the Medallion. By this point, there were no more than 500 medals of this design struck, the number of friends allowed in the circle at any given time, plus however many 1899 versions were created, which weren't many. So, long story short, only about 500 created, and so not necessarily the most collectible piece of art. Then in 1929, the design becomes a stock design for Mako and became an instant success. For years, this was a popular gift to new mothers. In 1993, this became a special issue for the Society of Medalists, the follow-up club to the Circle of the Friends of the Medallion. This is basically the same medal as the stock design, but with a different edge stamp that indicates that it was part of the Society of the Medalist series. For those who really like the design, in 1978, Mako began to add dates to their edge stamp. And since this piece was available on demand and struck essentially annually, a date set of motherhood medals could essentially be created, which is kind of interesting. Plus, of course, a non-dated example to represent the pre-1978. Another good example of this democracy made is the Democracy Made Safe for America medal, which is also known as the Triumph Token. Brenner first prepared these models in 1918 after the 1896 Cullum Geographical Medal by Lydia Field Emmett, as commissioned by the American Red Cross. The medal was never issued for its intended purposes in 1918. However, due to the nonprofit nature of the Red Cross, selling the medals for profit went against the Red Cross's nature. In 1931, then, Mako acquired the design from Samuel Brenner and used it to strike the Triumph Token. 2 years later, Mako used it again for the Studebaker Distinguished Service Award, and that same year for the Bird in Flight Medal. In 1941, they recycled the design for the I Did It Myself contest medal, and finally in 1942, Mako reissued the Triumph Token with the added inscription, "Good luck, happy returns," flanking Liberty. After that, they seemingly retired the design, but Mako's archives and records aren't necessarily the most comprehensive, so there very well could be other examples thrown in there as well. This and the Motherhood Medal are just two of many examples of Brenner's work that very well would have wound up into obscurity due to the overall rarity of the initial pieces, if not for Samuel Brenner selling the designs to Mako and Mako using them as stock designs. This was especially true for the Triumph Token, which otherwise would never have been issued at all because of the Red Cross predicament. In 1971, 50 years ago, for the centennial of Brenner's birth, Dick Johnson and Erwin Stolf put on an exhibition of Brenner's work at the Chase Manhattan Money Museum. For this event, Johnson was able to arrange for the original Galvanos of the Lincoln Cent, reduced by Henry Weil and Mako in 1909, from the vault of the United States Mint and put on display. In conjunction with the exhibition and the centennial, Johnson, who worked as an archivist, historian, and many other roles for Mako, arranged for a centennial plaquette to be struck. The obverse, you can see here, features the classic Lincoln portrait by Brenner as modeled in 1907. while the reverse shows a supposed self-portrait of Brenner that was sculpted in Paris as he studied with Roti. The self-portrait was said to have been in Dick Johnson's collection, but it is now untraced. If anyone out there knows where it is, let me know. In 2009, to commemorate the centennial of the Lincoln Cent, Dick Johnson and Mark Schlephorst commissioned Mako to strike a plaquette. The obverse design, again, featured the famous 1907 model of Lincoln, while the reverse shows Lincoln at work, touching up a die with a variety of engraving tools laid out in front of him. A ghostly image of Lincoln floats above with the quote, "My mind was full of Lincoln," flanked by a pair of iconic wheat ears. The quote is, in fact, a direct quote of Brenner that circulated throughout the nation's newspapers in February of 1909 as Brenner tried to explain his mental state as he created model after model of Lincoln until he got it just right. I don't want to say too much more about this piece because I know that Mark Schlephorst, the co-creator of the plaquette and also a fellow presenter at this year's COAC, hopefully plans on sharing a little bit more about the creation of this piece. Nonetheless, this piece is another instance of Mako helping propel the enduring legacy of Victor David Brenner. Very few other 20th century American sculptors have one, let alone two, medals created in their likeness by Mako. Interestingly, when the American Numismatic Society purchased the archives of the Medallic Art Company in 2018, the ANS hired co-presenter Taylor Hartley as a year-long curatorial assistant to begin processing the collection. While doing so, Taylor uncovered a collection of 17 Galvanos of Brenner's work. At no point did Mako ever claim ownership of any of these designs represented in the collection, meaning that none of them had die numbers. Several were early works that he sculpted during his first stint in Paris before Mako even existed, so they're obviously not Mako medals. As it turns out, these pieces were part of the collection that Samuel Brenner sold to Mako in 1931. Their personal nature, however, portraits and whatnot, not necessarily any designs that could be recreated as a stock piece, caused them to not be recreated and thus still relatively rare and none of them are necessarily considered more of his iconic works like the other pieces that were restruck by Mako. From there, these Galvanos were used by Dick Johnson for the 1971 exhibition at the Chase Money Museum, and most of them actually still have stickers on the back that correspond with the exhibition catalog for that show. And in a way, I found this as a clever way of Mako continuing to contribute to the legacy of Victor David Brenner. When I first began at the ANS in November of 2019, I came across a note that Taylor had left in the Mako files about these Brenner Galvanos. After realizing their connection to the 1971 exhibition, as well as Samuel Brenner, as well as the relative closeness of Brenner's Sesquicentennial, which we are now celebrating, I had begun to plan various celebrations that revolved around Brenner. So really, without uncovering these Galvanos, we might not all necessarily be sitting here right now. So thank you, Taylor, and thank you.
Any questions?
Here's
One thing I do want to point out for those of us who are in the room here at the ANS is that there are two additional Brenner plaques, Galvanos, on the wall there, which are part of a early ANS series of great figures in early American history. One is John Paul Jones, and the other of Amerigo Vespucci that were produced in 1903 and 1906. And I'll be talking about those briefly in my presentation. But Mark, did you have a question? Yeah.
So there's, Jesse, those very, collection that you mentioned of Mako. I've seen them in the drawers at Mako. Bob Hoff, when I met him, brought out, I think it was a Galvano of Teddy Roosevelt, and it was bent. And that he was going to straighten it for me, and we were going to make a die, and that never happened. Have you found that?
Unfortunately, no. That would be extremely interesting. Yeah, I'm not sure, of anything Roosevelt related. There was one bent piece. I think it was the Hambuchin Galvano. So I don't know if maybe the Roosevelt got discarded because it was too irreplaceable, too damaged or anything like that. But yeah, I haven't, unfortunately. Taylor, you didn't, right?
No, no, didn't. Thank you, Jesse. No, I didn't run across anything like that while I was looking. But I think I still have some of my handwritten notes at home. So if I look back through, no, not in any of the boxes that came, but I suppose it is always possible that it may have been with some of their Galvanos that are currently in storage.
Yep, yeah, that is a good possibility as well. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Taylor. Yeah, so it could be in Brooklyn.
I actually visited several times in conjunction with making that medal. It was quite difficult to make.
I'm sure.
I won't detail it, but not even tomorrow. But when I was there, there were 2 or 3 pallet boxes. I say pallet box, I mean a wooden box that sits on a pallet. The wooden box was about 4 feet tall, 4 feet by 4 feet by 4 feet. They were full of dies, hubs, and metals, and Bob Hoff was going to destroy them all. And his intent was to make sure that there was no chance that there could be commercial competition for them. That's what he told me. I offered to buy them, and
that would have offered commercial competition then, right? Yeah. That's unfortunate, but yeah. In the Mako archives, I've come across a handful. We have a die log book, and I think in September 3rd of 1987, a lot of early Mako dies were also destroyed, including some significant Brenner dies. So yeah, it happens. It's extremely unfortunate. Stuff like that is kind of the reason why our society exists, is to help keep that stuff for the future. So I'm sure that when things like that happen, all of our hearts break a little bit more. Thank you for sharing that, Mark. Any other questions, comments, concerns? Did I get anything wrong, Austin?
Yeah. There's a couple of questions in the chat.
Okay.
So the question here is were there size requirements or the various for Galvano?
I can't quite hear you, Austin.
Yeah, I'm also for Ben. How about? Can you hear me all right now? The question is really the size for the Galvano, the various mints that he submitted to.
can display the chat. I'll read it.
While we're waiting for the volume to be turned up a little bit, I do have a question about the economics of metal production. This is something I've become increasingly more interested in. Do we have any idea what Mako was charging for reducing these plasters or galvanos down to dyes, and any idea of how these then were paid for? I presume that if Brenner received a commission, that he would be paying Mako directly out of his own pocket, then essentially being reimbursed, or at least having that expense covered through the individuals or organizations that had commissioned him. Do you have any insight on that?
Unfortunately, no. That section and of Mako's archives are unfortunately lost. A lot of the earliest records were lost in the early 70s when they left New York City and moved to Connecticut. And from what I understand, a lot of boxes were simply thrown away. Again, Curator, break. So yeah, unfortunately, no. The closest that I was able to find in our archives related to their dyes at all was really just dye storage, which Mako actually stored their dyes at the A&S because, again, they were a small shop and didn't have the means to do a lot of things that we would expect a large mint to be able to do. So dye storage is as close as I can get to anything, unfortunately, at this point.
No, and sort of a follow-up question then too. In the various contracts that I've seen with Mako, and in fact this is also something that appears in contracts currently with Metalcraft, a metal producer up in Wisconsin that the ANS and the New York Numismatic Club has engaged with to produce metals. There's something about the company retaining the ownership of the dyes, which then presumably gives them the right to restrike, as they did with Brenner's metals in the from the 30s onward. So presumably once they have the dye, they can do whatever they want with it, and don't necessarily have to then pay a commission to the artist.
Right.
In this case, Brenner or his heirs.
I think that might be the case for a lot of the metals, but I know that there are certain instances where, say, a university has the ownership of an ongoing, annually presented metal. In that case, I think that Mako would probably get into a little bit of trouble if they were striking Peabodys every year, multiple Peabodys and stuff like that.
Well, I can't comment about how it used to be, but under Bob Hoff, I negotiated a 2-year exclusive for the use of them. But I also warned him that, according to my lawyer was my QA manager husband who worked at the patent office, that the artist could probably sue them if they used the reverse in any image. The copyright law is not quite clear on that.
Right.
But I'm not a lawyer.
Okay, I have done a little research on how Mako regarded dyes prior to World War II, both in writing about Rockwell Kent and then the New York Numismatic Club and a few other areas. And their position generally was that they would hold on to the dyes, but they would not own them. So for the New York Club, if the organization gave written consent, the president was able to get his own dye from Mako. For the other place, like with Rockwell Kent, they would hold the dyes. They would then take orders for metals to be struck. There were no setup charges. There were no handling charges. It was just a very small flat rate, like $10 or so for a bronze medal. But it was very clear from the correspondence that I've read that Mako did not own the dyes and never considered that they did. That was all like a later position.
As a follow-up to that, before we get a slew of emails regarding the Mako dyes, there was apparently a several-month period in during the bankruptcy, when if you claimed any ownership to the Mako dies, you could contact them and get your dies back. And if you did not do that, then those dies were part of the bankruptcy auction and you lost ownership to them. So any previous claims that that happened before 2018 are null and void from the bankruptcy auction. So.
Austin, can we try?
Yeah, let's try one more time. Can you give me a thumbs up, Jesse, because they just muted you, so I'm not. Yeah, you can hear me all right. Excellent. So the first question here is, did the various mints that Brenner was submitting to, did they have different Galvanos size requirements? And wait a moment, and they'll unmute you.
Well, Mako reduced the dies, so they had one VA Pantograph that could reduce a certain size Galvano. The Mint later on purchased their own VA reduction machine, which I'm assuming was perhaps a lesser model and could only utilize 9-inch Galvanos or smaller. After that point, then the dies existed. So all these individual mints no longer had to worry about the Galvano or the VA because they had the dies that were then put into the press and used to strike the metals. So at that point, any size of the original model no longer mattered to the individual mints. But it's a very good question.
And,
Any other?
There's another question here. Did Victor David Brenner engrave more medals, or was he producing more works in the round? Was he sculpting?
Well, he probably sculpted more medals than anything. Early on, he was trained as an engraver, and then he was one of the few trained engravers who successfully made the leap to the medallic art and sculpting. And then he did produce quite a few sculptures in the rounds, which we will have a great presentation on tomorrow. However, the majority are still are medals, medallic arts. Absolutely. I always liken the transition from engraver to sculptor the same to from silent films to talkies. You know, some of the actors and actresses couldn't quite make it, and that was absolutely the same with engravers. I mean, it's a completely different skill sets that they needed, and only a handful were able to do that, and Brenner absolutely did.
Thank you for watching the American Numismatic Society's YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe. And if you like our online resources, publication, and events, you can support the Society by becoming a member. And don't forget to check out our book and eBay stores. The links are below.